Good afternoon and welcome to the meeting of the San Diego Metropolitan Transit System Budget Development Committee. I'm your chair, Vivian Moreno. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Good afternoon. Just as a reminder, if you can please turn on your microphones when speaking. Moreno,
Present.
Ela Rivera is absent. Coble,
Present.
McCann, not here. Whitburn,
Here.
Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Clerk. Moving on to item number 2, which is public comment. Clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
We have no public comments.
Okay, we'll move on to item number 3, the approval of the minutes for our meeting on April 27th, 2023. Clerk, are there any members of the public who wish to comment on the minutes?
No public comments on the minutes.
Wonderful. We do need a motion and a second. If I may get a motion and a second.
Motion to approve.
And I'll second.
Thank you. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say nay. And there are no abstentions. So this motion passes unanimously. Thank you. We're going to move on to committee discussion items. Item number 4 is I missed to ask whether committee had any public comments. No, I don't think we usually do that, but I felt like I should give you guys the opportunity. Okay, so we're going to move on to committee discussion items. Item number 4 is the fiscal year 2023 preliminary operating budget results. And I think Mr. Meyer is here. Yes, wonderful. Go ahead, the floor is yours. How many minutes do you need?
15.
15 minutes? Wonderful, thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Gordon Meyer. I'm the manager of financial planning and analysis. So we're going to be taking a look at the preliminary results for the FY23 operating budget, which just ended on June 30th of 2023. So looking at the operating revenues first. So on the first line, we have fare revenue. So here we ended the year unfavorable to budget by about 3.4 million or 4.7%. Although we were unfavorable to the budget, we did finish the year up by 11.4 million or 20.3% above last year's passenger revenue. On the ridership side, we only have data through May because we're still waiting for June trolley ridership, but we did finish the year up by 11.2 million passengers or 21.4% up on the ridership side. So of that 3.4 million favorable variance through the end of the year, we estimate that about 1.4 million or roughly half was due to the strike and the reduced service levels. And the other portion of that variance we attribute to kind of a slowing of growth in the second half of the year. So we are very curious what FY24 is going to look like to see if it's trend worthy or not. Moving on to other operating revenue, the next line. So here we finished the year favorable by a little over $2 million or 9.4%. That was all favorable interest revenue as the Fed continued to increase rates in the second half of the year, as well as our cash balances were higher than we had initially projected in the mid-year budget. So overall, our operating revenues were unfavorable for the year by about 1.3 million or 1.4%. Moving on to expenses, so personnel costs, we finished the year unfavorable 1.2 million or 0.7%. That was due to a couple factors. First, we had unfavorable health and welfare costs within bus operations. We dissolved the IBEW union trust account at the end of FY22, and then we used those unspent funds as far into FY23 as we could until they were depleted. And we ended up running out of those funds a couple months prior to what we had planned on, so we came in unfavorable there. And then we also had a really bad year for workers' compensation payouts within bus operations. We had bumped that budget up significantly already at the mid-year budget, and we still missed that budget through the end of the year. Purchase transportation. So this is our first transit and transdev contracts, and this is really the big driver of the variance this year. So we finished the year favorable 7.2 million or 7.9%. On the paratransit side, we were already trending favorable before the strike because the passenger demand was not as high as we had planned on in the budget, and that is a demand responsive service. On the fixed route side, most of it was due to the strike, and combined, we estimate that about 4.9 million of that 7.2 million favorable variance was due to the strike. Next line, we have other outside services. So here we were 2.3 million or 5.5% unfavorable. So this was due to a couple items. Within MOW and track maintenance departments, we were favorable in service agreements. There were some big ticket items that due to timing are likely going to be pushed to next year. So we had favorable variances there. Same thing with construction expenses within bus. We had a lot of projects that used to be funded in the capital budget, and we started moving those into the operating budget if there's no new asset that's going to be generated. And so we had a big number in there this year for large repair projects, and then we were off on the timing of some of those expenditures. So we had a large favorable variance there as well. And then lastly, within administration, we had a $400,000 sign replacement project for orange and green line signs in the marketing department budget. And that the project started on time, but unfortunately the signs weren't delivered until July, which is the beginning of FY24. So we had a large favorable variance there, and then we'll have an unfavorable one to start this year. Next, we have energy. So overall, we were very close to budget at 19,000 unfavorable. But within energy, there were a couple things going on. So we finished unfavorable in electricity expenses, primarily due to rates, which came in about 4.4% higher than what we had planned on. Those were mostly offset by favorable CNG and propane expenses as well, mostly due to volumes as the strike reduced service levels as well as the need for those fuels. And then lastly, we have other expenses, which was favorable 240,000 or 0.7%. And that's mostly G&A expenses within administration. Particularly, we had some variances in credit card fees for the fare system. We came in favorable in travel expenses, and then also some permitting fees in the stormwater department. So overall, operating expenses came in favorable for the year by 8.5 million or 2.2%. So looking at revenues and expenses combined, we ended the year with a favorable net operating variance of just under 7.2 million or 2.5%. And of that 7.2 million operating variance, we estimate that about 4 million of that was due to the strike. So next we'll get into the non-operating activities for the year, which is mostly subsidy revenue. And before we look at the numbers, I'll give a very brief overview of the different categories. So federal, that's our recurring FTA funds that we receive for preventive maintenance and rural operations. Stimulus funds, that's both our CARES Act and ARP Act funds that are administered by the FTA. We received 360 million in total, and we've drawn about 228 million of that through the end of FY23, leaving us with about 132 million remaining until we've drawn all of it. Next, we have TDA. So that's the 1/4% regional sales tax assessed in the region, and it's administered by both Sandag and the county. Transnet, that's the 1/2-cent sales tax in San Diego County, specifically for transportation projects. We receive both a formula share every year, and then we also receive direct reimbursement from Sandag for BRT as well as Midcoast, which are Sandag funded operations. Next, we have state transit assistance or STA. That is the state sales tax on diesel fuel, and we get a share of that every year based on our San Diego population as well as agency revenue. And then lastly, we have a category for other, which includes some various smaller revenue agreements with different agencies. So now looking at the actual numbers for our non-operating activities. So first line is our recurring federal revenue. So here we ended the year 269,000 favorable to budget or 0.4%. That number came in higher because we were able to use a little more of our F5311 and 5311F rural funding based on our end of the year expenses and revenues. Next line, we have our federal stimulus funds. So here we came in higher than budget by a little over 3 million or 3.5%. Back at the mid-year adjustment in March of last year, the board approved a new strategy that instead of drawing our stimulus funds based on our structural deficit projection, that we would maximize our drawdowns and draw as much as we could based on eligible expenses. And then any of those excess funds would be put directly into the operating deficit reserve, which was also created as that motion. And so you can see down in the reserves line, there is a number of negative 3.2 million variance. So that represents the transferring of the excess stimulus funds into the operating deficit reserve. And so you can look at the non-operating revenue line. We came in favorable 221,000 overall, or 0.1%. The other piece of non-operating activities is debt service expenses, which is mostly our pension obligation debt expenses related to the pension bonds. And there we were favorable 24,000 to budget for a bottom line favorable figure of 245,000 or 0.1% for non-operating activities. So on this slide, you can see the combination of our operating activities and non-operating activities. So we had the 7.2 million favorable operating income for the year, and then we combine that with the non-operating activities. So we ended the year with a net deficit or a structural deficit of just under 30 million. Our budget figure had projected a $37 million structural deficit. So we did come in favorable looking at it that way as well. And then on the very bottom line, you can see our revenues less expenses for the year. So we ended the year for the overall operating budget was 7.4 million in excess revenues over expenses. And so that brings us to the contingency reserve balance. So our board policy sets the target at 12.5% of the operating expense budget each year. So for FY24, we have a target of 45 million for our contingency reserve. As we just looked at, we have 7.4 million in excess revenues over expenses from FY23, and staff is recommending the following allocation for that 7.4 million. 3.1 million to go to the contingency reserve to achieve our 12.5% target for FY24. And then we're recommending to move the remaining 4.2 million to the new operating deficit reserve for addressing structural deficits in the future. And that brings us to the official staff recommendation that the Budget Development Committee forward a recommendation to the Board of Directors to approve the allocation of excess revenues over expenses in FY23 to the following. 3.1 million to the MTS contingency reserve to achieve the 12.5% target for FY24, and then 4.2 million to the MTS operating deficit reserve for addressing structural deficits. And with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Meyer. Before we go on to committee questions or comments, clerk, are there any members of the public wishing to comment on item 4?
Yes, we do. Guadalupe Rojas, you can come up to the podium.
Hi, everyone. My name is Guadalupe Rojas, and I am a community advocate with Mid-City CAN's Youth Opportunity Pass program, and also known as YOP. YOP is important to us because many of our youth advocates are dependent on public transit, including our newest member, Mia. Mia depends on public transportation to get to school out in Mission Bay because her local high school does not offer college prep courses. Almost daily, her commute is about 2 hours. Despite the long commutes, she is determined to have a better education, and like many of our youth, Mia is eager to be part of the changes that will improve her community. Personally, I am happy that programs like YOP give fair chance regardless of the youth's socioeconomic background. Like many others, I would like to see a permanent program that will continue to benefit youth for years to come. That is why Mid-City CAN continues to obtain funds from the state and other local revenue sources. But we still need MTS to include the Youth Opportunity Pass program in its budget priority to ensure that youth continue to use public transportation. It is known that the money that will be received from the state will be used for ridership recovery. And it is important to know that youth make a good part of that ridership. In the first 9 months of the pilot program, over 5 million youth rides were recorded with YOP. In addition, there's nothing on SB 125 that prohibits MTS from using these funds towards the youth opportunity passes. That is why, as a community-based organization, we ask that you include YOP in the budget priority.
30 seconds left.
Thank you for your time.
That concludes public comments, Chair.
Thank you, clerk. Members of the committee, this is your opportunity to ask questions or make comments. And just a reminder, this is an action item, so I am looking for a motion in a second. Councilmember Goble.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of observations. You said the marketing signage is a timing difference. So we saw a surplus this year. We should expect to see also a $2 million effect next year or the current fiscal year. We
Yeah.
shouldn't be surprised.
Right.
Okay.
But we also have a laundry list of those kind of projects budgeted for this year, and so it also wouldn't be surprising to see some of those get delayed as well. So the net impact is really kind of anyone's guess. We're still trying to fine tune that as well. Tracking is better in the operating budget versus how they used to be tracked in the capital budget. So we're going to get a better handle on it, but yes.
And I think it will help the full board to know when those things occur, for you to tell us, oh, this is because of just a timing difference between last fiscal year and this fiscal year. That would certainly help the full board get out of a panic mode of any kind of negative numbers that might come up.
Okay.
So that's a suggestion. The structural deficit of 29 million is a lot less than what I think we saw at the budget. I think was 60 million structural deficit, if I remember, for the current year. Am I right in thinking that? Mike shaking his head no.
So for this year, the projected structural deficit in the forecast is 37. That's the same one. It jumps up and going forward to quite a bit higher, and it grows to 60 million.
Okay, so probably
Yeah,
look
but
at a
this
couple.
year wasn't projected. It was projected at 37.
So we have 132 million in stimulus money left. So we really have a little bit of breathing room. And with the SB 125 funds, hopefully, there's no sense for us, not no sense. There's a little more comfort that we have a little more breathing room.
Yeah, and that 128 million in stimulus funds is actually what we have left to draw, but we're putting a lot of that into reserves. So we actually have more than, just based on how much we're drawing, we have less than 2 years left to draw those, where we'll be able to draw those funds, but we'll be able to use them into 27, 28, 29, depending on how we allocate the SB 125.
Do you think we'll be able to use all those funds before they expire?
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
So just drawing them how we're doing right now avoids the risk of the funds lapsing. So there's no time constraints on the funds that are in our reserve. So we will definitely draw them before.
And what's really in the reserve is local funding, correct? What we replaced the stimulus, so we're spending down the federal and reserving the local.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I want the record to show that Mayor McCann has joined the meeting. I know these meetings are not on camera, so just wanted to make that note. Any other committee members wishing to make any comments? Hearing none, oh, I'm sorry. go
No,
ahead.
I just would be happy to make the motion.
Thank you, Mayor.
And I'll be happy to second.
Thank you so much, Chair. I think there's some really good news in this presentation. I am heartened that the ridership is up by 21.4% over last year through May. And I have to note, this number includes the strike, right?
Yes.
So we're 21.4%, including a strike that lasted about,
Well, this doesn't include June, so as a percentage, we probably expect it to trickle down a little bit, but it did include May, which it was roughly the same impact we'd expect in June, because it was about 2 weeks in each month for the strike. So partial impact of the strike. But the revenue includes the full impact, so we did finish the year 20%.
Yeah, that's what was gonna be my next point, that not only are we up in ridership 21.4% from last year, but that the revenue is also up 20.3, or as you mentioned, $11.4 million. I think we should take a moment to think about what would have happened if we didn't see the levels of growth. Our structural deficit, as was mentioned, is currently 30 million for this year. And without that extra 11.4 million in fare revenue, our deficit would have been over 41 million. So gains in ridership and revenue effectively eliminated 1/4 of our structural deficit for this year. So in my view, this is our path out of our structural budget deficit. I strongly feel that we need to keep investing in ridership and hope that the corresponding revenue increases slowly drag us out of this structural deficit. And then also, if I may point, can you remind us when the YOP program, Youth Opportunity Pass program, started? Yeah.
April of 2021.
Okay, so we don't have the revenue from the youth right now, right? In these numbers.
Yeah, we're getting paid by Sandag.
Gotcha. So this includes those numbers. Sorry. Got you. Okay. I got a little confused there. Thank you for that. So I think until then, I think we need to rely on our subsidy revenue, both to balance our budget and pay for the innovation needed to drive increased ridership. I do support staff's recommendation to use the 7.4 million in fund balance for this year to shore up our reserves. I think that's very prudent. And I think this is consistent with the board's direction to create the operating deficit reserve. So thank you to MTS staff for the presentation. And honestly, thank you for the success of this past year. I think these numbers are I'm very happy about these numbers. I know we've asked a lot of you guys and we've pushed you in uncomfortable positions, but I think these numbers are really showing that everything that we're doing, the marketing, the youth opportunity passes, right? This has all been a great success, and I think these numbers are showing it. So we do have a motion on the floor and we do have a second, and we are going to proceed with the voice vote. So all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Nope. This motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much for your presentation. And we're going to move on to item number 5, which is an informational report on Senate Bill 125 funding. Please take it away, Sharon.
Okay, so I'm going to run through this. I want to explain to you what the whole SB 125 funding from the state looks like. And then we're going to talk to you a little bit about a strategy we want to propose and get your feedback on that strategy. With that, I will. So the state of California gave $5.1 billion to fund transit between the years fiscal year 24 and 27. $4 billion of this comes from the Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program, which you may remember we get some discretionary grants from the state. We compete statewide for that program. But this one will be actually distributed directly by formula and based on population, which is critical for San Diego because that really helps us in the allocation. It's all based on the PUC 99313 formula, which is a formula that is the basis for the state transit assistance program, which it's an interesting footnote to this that we at MTS are the only transit operator that gets this directly. So we do not have to go through Sandag. All the other transit operators go through their local RTPA. That does bring with it some things that we have to do as an agency between now and the end of this calendar year, but I'll get to that in a minute. You can spend it on capital just like the TIRCP program, or it gives you the flexibility to spend it on operations. And I'll break that out for you in another slide. There is another component of this, 1.1 billion for the zero emission transit capital program. This is both population and revenue-based distribution, which is also the state transit assistance program distribution. But it does also include flexibility for transit operations. We anticipate receiving, based on the estimates provided to us, 284 million over the 4 fiscal years. And the majority of the funding, about 264 million, will come in the next 2 years. So SB 125 did provide for some strings. It put into place accountability and reform requirements for agencies to access this funding. They required the California State Transportation Agency, or CalSTA, to develop guidelines and administer accountability programs to govern the distribution of funds. So we've already seen in August, we received an informal draft. They held a couple of webinars, which we all attended. They put out the formal draft guidelines September 1st. And while those are not considered final, they are indicating they're not anticipating material changes to those guidelines. So what we understand today to be the requirements of the program should be the ones that we need to meet by the end of this calendar year. So the intent of these funds is to provide one-time multi-year funding so that transit operators can address the operational cost deficits that they have experienced due to the pandemic. And that's important to understand, that the state is really anticipating that transit operators will try to enhance their position in the out years, and that we will come up with a plan for ourselves in the out years. It also is meant to prevent us from having to cut service or to do anything that would, for instance, have to reduce ridership by things like cutting service and raising fares. They don't want us to have to do that. But it is also intended to help us increase ridership, exactly what Chair Moreno was referring to as our own mission. And so this is going to be a help to us. And then they want us to prioritize the availability of transit for riders who are transit dependent, disadvantaged communities, et cetera. So that is intent that is written into the legislation. So the guidelines themselves also promulgate that same intent. Eligible projects under TIRCP, you can have capital projects. Those must comply with the types of TIRCP funded projects in the regular program. So it has to be able to demonstrate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and an increase in ridership. So then in the ZETCP eligible projects, for capital projects, that would be purchasing zero emission buses, doing the infrastructure, retrofitting facilities for zero emission technologies. And then you would also have to demonstrate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's for use on capital. So for using these same funds for transit operations, you have to comply with the legislative intent. You're either going to try to prevent yourselves from cutting service, or you're going to be trying to increase ridership through the program. So the expenses are kind of laid out on what you can put in this money for operations. One is for retention of service, restoration of service, or increased service. And that's any increases in service after the first of this calendar year, meaning January 1st, 2023. Also, operating expenses intended to increase ridership. So for instance, if we added service, then that would be intended to increase ridership. And then operating expenses invested in increased safety and security measures. The thought on that end was the legislators believed that safety and security measures will enhance ridership because people will feel safe to get back into transit. So here's the kind of deadlines. An allocation package is due to CalSTA by December 31st, 2023. And as I mentioned, we are a direct recipient at MTS. And so we are the ones that have to put together the plan that goes to CalSTA. North County Transit District is not, and they will have Sandag creating their plan. So Sandag will create a plan and MTS will create a separate plan for our own funding. You need to address the projects and operations that will seek an allocation of funds for at least this fiscal year, 2024. But they highly recommend that you show plans for the entire program period through fiscal year 2027. You have to include the following details, but not limited to. The explanation of the funding and service actions, the breakdown and justification of funding distribution, detailed project descriptions and activities, and various data reports and sources. So it's a plan that MTS would have to work on between now and the end of this calendar year in order to get our allocation. And then just an important caveat to that is there is no limit to the number of times you can amend that. So if 6 months from now decide we want to go a different route, we can resubmit and show a different allocation plan, and that would be acceptable. CalSTA will review the allocation packages for completeness and project eligibility. They will not try to infringe on local decision-making processes. They will just be trying to make sure it's compliant with the details that are included in the final guidelines as they get finalized at the end of this month. And then, as I mentioned, on a rolling basis, you can resubmit your plans as needed. So this is the calendar. So by April 30th, 2024, CalSTA is required to start funding the requests for funding that they get from the transit agencies. So it all has to be done by that date. So we're ensured that we will get that funding that we request in the first year here at MTS by the late spring. And then, so zero emission transit capital program. These funds are a little bit more specific and a little bit more targeted, but since the board's direction is to go as quickly as we can towards 100% zero emission bus transition, we had already included in our forecasts for future CIPs certain projects, especially on the infrastructure side. So what staff would propose is that we take all of the funding in the zero emission transit capital program that is coming to MTS, which is the smaller pot of money, that we program that all in the infrastructure projects for zero emission bus. And so that's what this looks like, 46.3 million over the course of the 4 years for the totals on the bottom. And this would help us retrofit the existing bus divisions so that they can accept more zero emission buses. For the bigger pot of money, the transit and intercity rail capital program money, one of the things that we would like to do is fund a project that is underfunded right now. It's an existing TIRCP recipient. We received $16 million for it. We would like to allocate the remainder required to get this done. And this will significantly improve operations on the orange line. And the goal would be to try to get that done 100% using this, this pot of money. That is a total of 26 million. For that one, and I'm going to do a roll up of the TIRCP at the end, but just to let you know that that is 26 million of the money. So then the rest of it we would like to look at for doing operational funding. And so the staff proposal on this is one would be the security enhancements that we're taking to the board of directors tomorrow. At the request of the board. And this would be to fund the 47 positions for the security department. And that would be about 5.5% of the total TIRCP that would be coming to us through this program. Then we would like to enhance the trolley. The trolley service has bounced back faster than any light rail service in the United States. And the rationale for enhancing trolley is that we feel like there is an untapped reserve of people who would like to use the trolley. Unfortunately, at off-peak times on the orange and green line, for instance, we still have 30-minute service, which is really not high-quality rail service. So we would like to go to a minimum of 15-minute service all day, every line, effective in June of 2024. And then Midcoast always anticipated that eventually we would go to 7.5-minute frequency between Old Town and UTC. And we do believe that that would be a good use of this funding. We wouldn't be able to put that into effect until June of 2025, when the rail cars that were purchased by Midcoast are finally brought in for that 7.5-minute service. But we think that that would help, especially in during the peaks. And the rationale is that there's a lot of jobs up in the UTC area that are not the normal 9-to-5 jobs. And I think that's an untapped, again, reserve of people who could use transit if it was made convenient for them. Bus service enhancements also we would like to see an investment in. One would be to replace the driver-related cuts that we've had to make over the last 2 years because we had shortages of drivers. So that would be an eligible expense. The board anyway wanted us to do that, and we were going to be budgeting for that anyway. So this will be able to use some of the state's funding and leave the local funding for other uses. Another would be to do span and frequency adjustments to existing routes. A lot of the routes could benefit from that frequent either 10 or 12 or 15-minute service. And so we would want to recommend that. And then under Elevate SD 2020, we had anticipated putting in a bus route overnight between downtown and the border, the international border. And so we wanted to look at that as a potential way to invest in the service, because that is, again, not something that we can do on the Blue Line because of the rail traffic, the freight rail that we have to allow during the middle of the night. But there, again, it's a recognition that not every job is 9 to 5. And so this would potentially be a good source of increased ridership. All of these service enhancements would require us to, really do deep dives, and that's very specific. And I've gotten a little specific so you see the magnitude of what we're talking about. But again, this is going to be more of I'm asking you for more of a high level, are we on the right path for the strategy for the use of these funds? And then Iris Rapid Operations begins this fall, and we had always anticipated finding funding in our current operating budget, but this would actually be a way to use the state funding and then free up other funds for other purposes in the future. And then finally, I believe that some of the funding we could put into the structural deficit balancing. And I'm not talking about a lot of it. I'm talking about 30% of it, with the understanding that we can amend this our strategy over time. And if other sources of funding come forward, like a ballot measure or things like that, we don't necessarily have to hold it in reserve. We could actually invest it in more service or other programs. So here's the breakdown just for the transit and intercity rail capital program. It breaks down to about 26% of all of the funding. I'm suggesting not just for the TIRCP, but also for the zero emission capital program. About 26% to go to capital, about 38% to go to enhanced service, about 30% to the structural deficit, and about 5.5% to security. In a way that I'm just trying to explain to balance out the strategy, and obviously it could be tweaked many different ways. But so this is the breakdown of the TIRCP program. And then here's our original operating budget forecast. As you've seen this on multiple occasions with the deficits in the red. And then the reserves and the stimulus, use of the stimulus, with the projection that by fall of 2026, we were going to actually run out of money. Here's the revised, using the SB 125 as I've put in our proposal, that this would then push out the deficit until FY 2029. And with that, obviously, the question is, what is available to us once we hit 2029? And the, obviously, there's increasing subsidy revenues. The State Transit Transformation Task Force is going to be meeting, and it would be my goal to see, are we going to anticipate possibly increasing TDA? It's been since 1976 since they created TDA. Transportation Development Act, maybe we need to be looking at a statewide initiative or some other way to start investing in transit. And then we could also seek federal assistance, as everyone in the United States is facing these same kind of structural deficits. We are still statutorily allowed to create a ballot measure that is an MTS specific ballot measure. So we could always revisit that. And then there's the traditional: raise the cost of fares, cut service, defer capital investments. All those things are available to us in the future. But this gives us a little bit of a ramp, longer runway to get us to find a better solution. So with that, I'll take whatever feedback the committee chooses.
Thank you so much. Before we go to committee, are there any members of the public wishing to comment?
We do have public comments. Manny Rodriguez, you can make your way to the podium. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, committee here, and thank you, CEO Sharon Cooney. I want to share some history on SB 125. SB 125 was in response to the governor's budget, which did not include funding for transit. And because of that, a lot of transit agencies like MTS through the California Transit Agency and organizations like SANDAG pushed hard for funding for transit. But it was also hundreds of community-based organizations, advocacy organizations, and just community groups all throughout the state, up and down the state, that were, wrote hundreds or thousands of letters, met with their legislators, staged protests in response to the governor's budget. And because of all that advocacy and all that organizing and all those letters and protests, we got SB 125 passed. MTS has showed through the previous item that we saw that they've been doing a really great job at, getting our transit system up and running after the pandemic. And I have no doubt that with SB 125, things will be even better. I'm here on behalf of the San Diego Transportation Equity Working Group, and we do have some priorities for SB 125, which we will share with you all later. But I do want to share that overall, this is amazing, and I do think they are doing a good job with using Elevate SD as a blueprint for where to allocate that funding. And I and many of the other transit riders and future transit riders look forward to the increased frequencies on our lines. Thank you.
That concludes public comments, Chair.
Wonderful. Let's turn it over to our committee. Any committee members wishing to speak? Chair Whitley?
Well, thank you very much, Chair Moreno. And I guess I should start by expressing my appreciation to our state legislative delegation for advocating at the state level and securing these funds, which are going to be so important to the ongoing operations of MTS. And a big thanks to the community as well. As Mr. Rodriguez said, there was a great deal of advocacy that helped to get us here as well. And I'll also thank the staff. I think that the buckets that you have identified for this funding are very thoughtfully put together, certainly with an eye toward increasing ridership, the security enhancements. I mean, those are something that we hear people request regularly so that they can feel safe and secure. on our trolleys and buses. So I think that'll help us to increase ridership, the increased frequency certainly of the trolley. The overnight bus service from downtown to the border. I mean, if we move forward with that, there are so many service workers that work late into the night and into the early morning hours. I think that would be a huge service to them. And then, of course, we want to prevent service cuts down the road. We want to increase service. So allocating some of these funds to invest in mitigating the structural budget deficits in the future, I think, is very prudent as well. So I like the overarching direction that you're headed. I do think that this is an important presentation that the full board should see as well. So I would offer a suggestion that the full board be presented with this at the October meeting if possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Goebel.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Whitman, I agree with you. October would be a great time to present this to the full board. It's just that significant. A couple of observations. When you say the state allocation from this, I think you said there's a PUC code 51933-FLBQ. It sounds that like that's favorable to us. And the reason why I say that is sometimes when you do a good job in managing your money, people say, well, you don't need as much because you're good at it and the state keeps it. I know in healthcare that happens. It sounds like in this case, it was population based and things like that. So I find that our staff manages our system better than some of the other larger cities, and that our deficit was much lower than some of the other larger cities in California. And it's nice to know we didn't get dinged for staff being good at managing the expenses. So that's good news in terms of the amount of money. The 47 or so safety positions, does that split between code enforcement and armed?
It would be code compliance inspectors, which are MTS internal employees. So it would only be that internal employees.
And then are they typically accompanied by a contractor?
Yes, so there'll be a trained team, but the code compliance inspectors are able to write sites, but they're also a lot more visible. They're higher paid. They're tend to be longer term employees than our contract employees. We just felt like they were probably, and our focus groups bore this out in that almost everybody said that they were the ones they felt had the most authority and gave them the greatest sense of safety. So that's really the rationale. We just felt like our training program for code compliance inspectors, you know, is top notch. And, you know, to the extent that our code compliance inspectors are already recognizable to the public as really the face of MTS.
So my question is, we don't have to wait for funding for a contract guard to accompany them to travel in pairs. The code compliance can travel by themselves.
Right. It's a significantly larger population of contract security guards.
Okay, sounds good. I would like to see a first mile, last mile test in there somewhere. As we're trying to attract new writers, I don't think it would be expensive. Even 1% of the total thing would be $3 million. And I cannot imagine a test costing $3 million, whether that's reimbursement of a ride share to get to the station. I think that is an audience that we're not getting fully yet, is that audience. So I'd like to see consideration of a first mile, last mile test, either to get from the trolley to your workplace or from your home to the trolley. So I know it's informational only, but that's an opinion. Finally, at a SANDAG meeting this week, Monday, the airport extension was discussed, and expanded bus service was discussed, expanded trolley service was discussed, and the people mover was discussed. so far the leaning seems to be going towards the elevated people mover concept. And so I asked the question, well, that's great. If we build this, which agency is going to be responsible for running it? And they said they don't have an answer yet. I don't know that it's before 2029, but if there's any, if they're going to expect MTS to operate that and expect MTS to start contributing costs along the way, I think we should be aware of that and maybe factor that in here somewhere, or funding to go with it. So I don't want us to be surprised if the airport authority says, by the way, MTS, you're going to operate this elevated people mover. So just a heads up.
Well, I can tell you that that's not their prerogative to tell us that we're gonna operate it. That's all of you. So, and it really is, so far out that it's way past the horizon of these funds.
That's good. I just want to make sure we're all aware and everything's on the table. So, okay, that's my comments. Thank you.
And I would just follow up with that to say, that's kind of this weird gray area of when you have these new projects, that's something totally different. I don't think legally Sandag has the right to do a project and force MTS to take it. So that would be figuring out the time frame of when does our board weigh in and affirmatively say, if you build that, then you can turn it over to us and we will own and operate it. And so that'll be something we'll have to watch the process of, at what point is it looking final enough that we need to insert ourselves in? And that's something that we'll have to bring to our board to kind of decide when they want us to make that clear.
Thank you. Does that conclude your comments? Wonderful. Okay. So I too have some high level comments of my own. First and foremost, thank you, Sharon, for keeping us up to snuff on SB 125. I think this has been one of the most informed budget committees, right? And of all time, I can't say of all time, but certainly share our thanks to Mr. Pimentel, right, of the California Transit Association. I think he was here 3 months ago, sharing this information with us, which I think is also, it's very prudent for us to take this information to the board. So, you know, Senate Bill 125, I think, is another opportunity for MTS to invest in our future. Because of the subsidy funding, we have the time and the funds, I think, to get really creative on our ridership and revenue. I'm going to continue to emphasize investment in services that generate ridership, alongside a spirit of innovation to seek more customers as efficiently as possible. I think one possible idea is to come up with a plan to invest in transit amenities, such as shelters, benches, trash cans at the bus stop. Right now, we don't provide many amenities for our bus riders. Given the heat the past few weeks, I can't even imagine somebody waiting without a bus shelter to cover them from the element. But I think perhaps making the experience of riding the bus more welcoming, we can increase ridership. I know the bus is one of our strong suits, right? Our buses are packed right now. And I think that's a really good sign. And I think we need to continue to grow our business where we actually have business. As I mentioned, I do believe that we do need to take this to the board. I would suggest that we take it to the board as an informational item, and that you come back to this committee as an actionable item with more specific actions on how we're going to spend this fund. And I think it's not only just for us as a committee to know what we're doing, but also for the sake of transparency and for the sake of public access. The public needs to be involved in this process. And so I would like, I don't think we need a motion, right? But if we can get staff's commitment that will come back, I think we have a budget committee the month of November. It would be great to have an actionable item there with specifics on how we are going to be spending the money. One of the things that, and you know, it's really interesting that you bring up Sandag, because I had the privilege of going to Sandag in lieu of our council president, Sean Elo, and we got an update on everything happening at the state and federal level, and nothing was mentioned about SB 125, which was a surprise to me because it's going to be so impactful to our region. And so one of the things you didn't mention that I will ask you about is in connection to SB 125 is AB 761, which is the Transit Transformational Task Force. Are you on the committee? How is that playing out?
So I'm anticipating that there'll be several transit operators who will be on the committee. I'm slated to become chair of the California Transit Association in November. And so I would probably be chosen as the chair to be on that committee.
And how are people going to be chosen?
So there's how many people on that committee? There's like 45
Oh, wow.
different stakeholders that can be on the committee. So how each stakeholder group is going to choose their individual has not been decided yet.
Okay. Yeah. Next year is what we're hearing is when that's going to be decided.
Right. Once this portion of it, AB 125 gets done, and then they're gonna like put definition on the whole task force and what their mission is and those kind of things. I think we'll get more information as to who's on the committee, on the task force.
Thank you, thank you. So leaning a little bit more into the comments, I think, number one, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for letting us know. The purpose of this funding is ideally to boost up ridership. And although the presentation did show how we are going to keep our agency running, right, with the infrastructure, I think it lacked a little bit of emphasis in the ridership component of it. That's something that I'd like to see more of. We have an amazing opportunity to be able, as I always share with you guys, to be innovative, to keep on pushing that line, and so I'd like to see a little more of that. I don't know if that's through youth opportunity passes. I don't know if that's through amenities. I don't know if that's through making people feel safe, on the bus with more of our, what did you call them?
Code compliance.
Code compliance folks. I don't know what the answer is, but I think everything should be on the table. And I think there should be a stronger community component to it, an opportunity for community to weigh in, whether they want to get involved or not, but allowing them an open door to be able to express to us what they want to see. Ultimately, the board is the one that makes the decision, but I think it's prudent for us to bring them in the fold. It's a lot of money. It's a great opportunity. MTS is doing a great job. Let's continue doing a great job and pushing the envelope a little bit, right? Getting innovative. So that would be my 2 cents. And so you're going to the board, coming back, actionable item November. I don't need to make an action item on this, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank
and I would emphasize that whatever plan we provide in the tight timeline of December 31st of this year, that plan is a document that can be changed over time. So as we want to look at new and certainly the kinds of service enhancements we're talking about is predicated on us being able to increase staff on a basis, that's pretty rigorous. We're going to have to be recruiting. We're already doing that because we are already having a challenge staffing up, but we're really going to have to bring in as much HR resources as possible.
Yeah, no, and we definitely, is it a percentage of the funding that you want to go towards staff?
No, it
Or
would
you
just
don't wanna-
be related to what our service enhancements would be. So how many people, for instance, for Iris Rapid, that was already budgeted. We already knew we were going to increase that service. So we've already ramped up on the number of bus drivers that would be required for that. But, if we're going to try to institute this overnight service from downtown to the border, we're going to need to hire bus drivers to operate that. It's every incremental increase in frequency is going to add to the number of operators. So staff here at MTS and
Yeah.
our contractors.
I think that goes without saying, right?
Yeah.
That we absolutely need to put that figure in. All I'm advocating for is the community to come and be a part of it, right? You lightly touched on Elevate, and I think in order to get the community on board, to get the conversation back, I think we need to have a stronger relationship with our community, have them have a say in this process. This is a great opportunity. This wasn't money that we were, I'll put my air quotes, expecting, right? I know we were expecting it because we knew about it, but it definitely, I think, is a great opportunity for MTS and for the community. So thank you for the presentation. We look forward to seeing you at the board in October, and we are going to be moving on to item number 6, which is our next meeting date. We will have a meeting date in November is what is my understanding. So we're going to move on to item number 7. Is there any other staff or committee member communications we'd like? No? Okay, hearing none, we're going to move on to item number 8, which is the adjournment. Thank you for all those that attended. Thank you for the folks from the community that came today. And the meeting of MTS Budget Development Committee is now adjourned. Have a wonderful day, everybody.